Started off in Lodi, California. It was a beautiful day. There was some weather out there, but that it was moving towards the east. Essentially, that weather just stalled, and we were completely socked in. I couldn't return. I knew we were going to stall, and I had enough time to tell my wife and daughter, "I'm sorry. I don't think we're going to make it."
White County 911. What is your emergency?
Hi, I'm in an airplane and I crashed when I'm in the mountains.
My name is Brian Brown. I've been a pilot since I was 16 years old. I hold a single-engine land rating. I have about 300 hours. As a profession, I'm a professional fire captain. I've been in the fire service for over 25 years.
On May 26, 2012, November 4640 Lima departed Lodi, California, carrying Brian, his wife Jayanne, and daughter Heather. With a planned stop in Susanville, California, the trip should have been an uneventful 4-hour flight to Mountain Home, Idaho, where Brian and Jayanne's oldest daughter lived. A private pilot with no instrument rating, Brian had been watching the weather for days. At the time of departure, Brian noticed some weather moving over the Idaho mountains, but felt confident it would be gone by the time they reached that point in their flight. The first leg to Susanville was uneventful, and Brian took this opportunity to once again check the weather. He noticed it wasn't improving, and hadn't moved out of his flight path as fast as he anticipated. Not willing to take any risks with his wife and daughter on board, he decided to postpone his departure from Susanville several hours as they waited for the weather ahead of them to clear. Around 2 p.m. that afternoon, Brian saw conditions improve enough to finish the flight, and they departed for Mountain Home. The second leg of the flight was proceeding as planned until they reached the Owyhee Mountains. With only about an hour of flight time to Mountain Home, the conditions had deteriorated considerably.
Essentially, that weather just stalled. It didn't move. My hopes was that, again, that I'd just be right behind it, and we ended up pretty much hitting it. And the rain was so hard that I couldn't see through the windshield. So I made a 180-degree turn and was going to fly back to the next closest airport.
The closest airport was Rome State, Oregon, a remote gravel strip with no signs of civilization in any direction, save for a few tie-downs off the edge of the runway.
Kind of was thinking, you got to be kidding me. This is not really at all what I anticipated or planned out of this flight, of course.
Brian set 40 Lima down on the gravel, and once again the Browns intended to sit out the weather. Constant rain forced the Browns to stay inside the only shelter they had for several hours.
And we were all, bound up in my Cessna 172, which is pretty small for 3 adults, and cold. It was cold, and everything was just kind of building up. And the girls did ask me, my wife and daughter asked, what would it take to continue this flight? And I said, well, I have to have clear visibility, and I have to have daylight, and I really have to have no weather, to where I will feel comfortable continuing on with this flight. Several hours went past. During that time, I was recalculating from Rome State to Mountain Home so I could make sure we had adequate fuel and everything again. And I was just doing all my planning and making sure that those answers that I gave the girls were going to hold true.
Finally, the weather started to clear, and Brian once again saw conditions he felt comfortable dealing with. With only an hour of daylight left, enough time to reach their destination, they departed the gravel strip and headed north. They passed over several ridge lines, hoping the weather ahead of them would continue moving east. But it didn't.
Weather truly just started forming right in front of us. Started seeing some towering cumulus to the north of us, so I started to veer south. And then as I started moving south, I saw more start to form to the south and realized again that we couldn't continue this flight. And so I turned around to look behind me to go back, and we were completely socked in. I couldn't return. At that point, trying to keep my visual cues of the terrain and to stay out of the weather, I was basically at a point where I was sked running. I was just about 1,000 feet above the terrain and just under the cloud layer, just so I could, again, stay out of the weather. I did have one point where I had a cloud in front of me that I had to go through. And when we did do that, we cleared the other side, and sure enough, there was a mountain right on the other side of it that we had to make an abrupt maneuver for. So we maneuvered away from that and then continued the flight. And I made it over a couple more ridge lines, and the last one right before our impact, what I did notice was my airspeed was at 110 and it instantly dropped to 40. I knew we were going to stall. And I had enough time to tell my wife and daughter, I'm sorry, I don't think we're going to make it. Told them I loved them, and I put the nose of the plane down into the canyon to try and keep flying the aircraft. Right before we made impact to the bottom, I felt flight control back, and I abruptly pulled the nose up as steep as I could and was actually trying to fly back out of the canyon. We hit two trees and that took about 3 feet off of each wingtip, and then we abruptly hit belly first right into the next mountainside.
The impact knocked both Brian and Jayanne unconscious. He was awakened, surprised to still be alive, by his daughter's voice.
The next thing I heard was my daughter screaming for her mother, and when I looked over to the passenger side, I saw my wife Jayanne hanging out of the plane like a rag doll. The seatbelt was holding her in place. The door was ripped off on her side from the impact. And at that point, I think my professional rescuer mode kind of kicked in, and I reached over, I grabbed Jayanne and pulled her back into the airplane, and when I saw her face, her eyes were rolled into the back of her head, and she had deep snoring respirations. And it's, for people that aren't medically trained, for me, it was something I've seen many times over my career. It's a sign of a pretty significant head injury, and usually not really good outcome. And so at that point, I thought I'd killed my wife. I pulled her back into the plane. I got her head in line and opened her airway the best I could. Heather was helping me hold on to her head and keep her in place. Right about in that minute's time, her eyes kind of fluttered open, and she took a big gasp of air and said, I'm still here, I'm still with us.
November 4640 Lima was sitting on the side of a 60-degree slope. Despite his flight bag and everything else having slid into the tail cone of the plane, Brian was able to find his handheld transceiver. With the plane's avionics dead, he used his transceiver to verify his ELT was activated. At this point, darkness was setting in, and it started snowing heavily. Knowing they'd have to shelter in the airplane overnight, Brian fastened the door back onto the passenger side, and they waited.
We were really facing hypothermia too at that point. And that was my biggest next fear, was that we may not, even though we survived the crash at this point and our injuries, we may not survive the hypothermia of the evening.
Fearing complications from their head injuries, Heather called out to her parents every 15 minutes to verify they were still conscious. This continued for several hours, until around midnight, when they were startled by the sound coming from the tail of the airplane.
One of our phones picked up enough of a signal to receive the call that was from my oldest daughter, the one that we were traveling to see. She wanted to know why we hadn't made the destination yet.
They hadn't thought of using the phones immediately because they had gotten buried under a lot of debris in the back of the airplane. Scrambling to get the call, Heather found 2 phones.
The phone that was ringing had a battery that was just barely still intact. It was showing in the red, and it had one tiny little intermittent bar of signal that would flutter in and out. But Heather took the 2 phones and she waved them around in the back seat, dialing 911 over and over and over again, and finally got one to connect.
White County 911, what is your emergency?
Hi, I'm in an airplane and I crashed when I'm in the mountains.
Where are you at, hon?
In at 29 miles east or west of Mountain Home, Idaho. I need you to send a search party, please.
Okay, I want you to stay on the line with me, okay?
I will try my best, but my phone has very little battery left.
Are you in Owyhee County?
I have no idea where we are. My name is Heather.
Brian Brown, I'm the pilot.
Brian Brown is the pilot.
Did he file a flight plan? Heather?
Yes?
Did Brian file a flight plan so that we may be able to track him?
No.
Where were you coming from?
Rome.
Rome?
The Oregon gravel runway in Rome.
Okay, where are you flying to?
Mountain Home, Idaho.
Mountain Home, Idaho.
Brian, is there a way you can give me GPS coordinates?
Oh, ma'am, my GPS is down. Everything is down in the plane.
What are your injuries?
We have 2 head injuries and some back injuries.
Heather, what I'm going to do is contact AT&T, and they can ping that phone. So keep it on as long as possible, so that they will be able to get a GPS coordinates for me. Okay?
Okay, do it quick.
That was when our phone call dropped. So we got just enough information out to start the search, and you know, again, the relief for me was, wow, somebody knows we're out here. We're in the middle of the mountains. We're one step in the right direction. We're still alive, and somebody knows to come and start looking for us. So we actually got another phone call out. It was 911 again.
Hawaii County 911.
It's Heather.
Heather,
Yeah.
I have your GPS coordinates. Your emergency transmitter, is it working?
It is working, yes.
Okay. I need to know how many people are on that plane.
3.
You have 3 people. I have head injuries and back injuries. Do we have any other injuries?
Not that we know of.
That's the best I could assess, ma'am. I'm
Okay.
able to get up and walk around, but my head is split open pretty good.
Okay. Brian, I don't want you walking around too much. I would like you to try to sit down. What I'm going to do is I'm going to let you go. I have officers headed up in that way. They are going to have their overhead lights on. As soon as you can see overhead lights, will you call me back so I can let them know?
We'll try.
Okay.
Myself can keep service.
We have no way to signal them, ma'am. Hey, are they flying in?
No, they're coming in pickup.
There's no way, ma'am. We're in the middle of the mountains.
We have 4-wheelers and everything like that, and I'm going to get a helicopter launched.
Around 2 o'clock in the morning, we could start to hear rescue helicopters flying overhead. My first thought was, oh, I can talk to them. So I picked up the portable radio again from between my feet, and when I turned it on, the cold had actually already killed the batteries in it. The conditions were pretty close to whiteout, so they couldn't actually see us. And we couldn't see them, we could only hear them. We listened to that for about another half hour to 45 minutes, and then the helicopter stopped. And my biggest fear at that point was, you know, shoot, they've stopped looking here, and they're going to go look somewhere else. You know, so we're just going to have to bear down even longer.
What he didn't know is that the rescue team knew his approximate location, but couldn't continue due to the intensity of the snowfall, and had to call off the search and wait for better weather to arrive. The next morning around 6, they heard the helicopter again. Brian decided he would try to light a signal fire to catch the rescuers' attention.
So as soon as I had stepped out and reached down to light the signal fire, the helicopter flew right over the top of us. And I didn't have time to light the signal fire, but what I did do is I grabbed my cell phone and I turned the camera on and started flashing him with the camera flash on the phone. And he saw it. He went into a hover, and it was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen, because I'd realized at that point we'd been found.
Once we got to Silver City, we met with the Owyhee County deputy and their sheriff's posse, who had been searching for the victims all night long, and they had located them in a ravine about 15 miles from where we were at. They were working with the Idaho Air National Guard to get a helicopter to be able to come in and do a hoist operation, but because of the steepness of the ravine they were in, they weren't sure that they were going to be able to do that. So we split up our rescue team and we jumped on four-wheelers and ATVs with the Owyhee County Sheriff's Posse members, and we started heading back in, towing our gear in a Stokes basket and a sked stretcher behind one of the ATVs. And we went through solid snow, whiteout conditions at time, heavy snow drifts, some pretty treacherous terrain. Once we reached the actual crash scene, we had to determine how we were going to get them out. So we started to make a plan to take them out to Silver City to where they would be transported by ground ambulance. And that was going to be a big project to get done. So we prioritized the patients, and we determined that Brian Brown, the pilot, that his wife Jan and daughters were in worse shape than he was. So we decided his daughter Heather would be the first one that we would transport out. So we started to package. As more assets arrived at the scene, we had Idaho Mountain Search and Rescue, who was a huge help. We had Nampa Fire Department personnel on scene. We had the Air St. Luke's flight nurses and flight medics and their crews on scene. And somewhere right in that time, as we were prioritizing the patients, we found out that the Idaho Air National Guard was actually launching a bird, and they were going to be coming to our location.
And from that point on, the rescuers just kind of kept coming and packaged us up, and then ended up hoisting us out one at a time with a National Guard hoist helicopter.
All of the missteps on this flight could fit under one broad umbrella: poor choices. The decision for a non-instrument rated pilot to continue into marginal conditions, the pressure to prove that a light GA aircraft can serve a utilitarian purpose when other options are more viable, the choice to press on without any plan B over unfamiliar and unforgiving terrain. But it goes deeper than that label. Under pressure to continue despite questionable weather, with a narrowing window of daylight over mountains, and the frustration of previous delays, it's easy to see what we want to see, and not what's really there.
And when I left Rome State, I saw a condition that I felt very comfortable to continue. There was a large clearing in the weather, and I accepted that large clearing as being good enough instead of actually getting that last weather report to see what could happen. I know that mission-driven mindset made me take some risks that I wouldn't have normally taken. And here I found myself just slowly being convinced that this flight was still safe enough to continue. I would have terminated the flight in Susanville if I could do it over again. My mission would have still been complete if we'd have flown back, gotten in the car, and driven to see our oldest daughter. Would it have been stressful or frustrating? And sure, it would have been. And again, our egos as a pilot, I didn't complete the mission the way I wanted to, but the mission would have been complete, and we wouldn't have had to have gone through what we went through that day and that night on the mountain. I wish I could take all that back, because I didn't start that flight thinking I was going to crash in the side of a mountain, and I did.
Any long cross-country flight over mountainous terrain should require extra precautions, like choosing a route that minimizes time spent over remote areas, filing a flight plan, obtaining flight following, and checking in with Flight Watch for updated weather reports. And if things go bad, there's always the option of contacting ATC to declare an emergency.
I didn't always file a flight plan, but I pretty much always used flight following, and in this flight I didn't do that. And I had that mindset that, well, my daughter Tabitha's at the other side. She's in cell phone contact with us all the time. She knows where we're going, what our route is, and we're stopping and calling her. We had called her in Susanville. We called her in at Rome State, and we called her at Lodi before we left. I had that false sense of security that the cell phone and having contact with somebody was a flight plan, and it's not. It's not anywhere close to that. If I'd had the flight plan and I'd gone down The rescuers would have probably started 30 minutes or so after our crash versus the 3 hours that it took before my daughter called. You know, same with flight following. Had we been using flight following, that notification time that from the time we crashed to the time people started looking would have been even narrower.
It also pays to make sure the airplane is equipped properly and contains the necessary gear for the trip. For example, while shoulder harnesses would not have prevented the accident, they would have greatly reduced Brian and Jay-Ann's injuries. Warm clothes and survival equipment such as a PLB could also have helped.
We had lap restraints only. It was a 1966 Cessna, and I would put shoulder harnesses in a new airplane for sure that weren't equipped with one, because it would have had a definite different outcome for the both of us.
You have to do some planning to be able to deal with some of the things that you may face. When I go into the backcountry, there's gear that's going with you every time. You need to be able to start a fire. You need to be able to signal somebody. You need to seriously consider some sort of GPS system that's going to allow you to mark where you're at and the path that you've taken in, because it's easy to get lost. For pilots, that's going to be a difficult thing to do, because the storm or whatever the circumstances were that caused you to crash in the Oahe Mountains may not have allowed you to mark your location. But those survival skills and those survival gear is something that you have to have.
We left in California weather. It was nice and warm and comfortable, so my wife and daughter were in basically capri shorts and thin blouses and sandals. Look at that flight path. That's what I would tell people, again, is, you know, from point A to point B, or point A to point Z, whatever's in between that, consider that you're going to have to spend some time there and plan for that whole route.
Above all, always be learning. Invest in yourself. Experience may be the best teacher, but confidence comes from having the skills to meet those experiences.
I don't know what kind of trips you make. Some people just make short $100 hamburger hops that don't require flying over the mountains or, you know, unusual terrain, but you just don't ever know. And part of your pilot skill sets, in my mindset, you know, even though I'm a professional rescuer, is having basic first aid is a must. I don't think my wife would have survived that night had I not known what to do. And the best survival equipment you can have is knowledge of first aid and just basics of how to survive without much equipment at all, because that's truly where we were. I was dealing with just what we had in the aircraft, and if you did have just something simple, that's great, whatever it is, but know how to use it. That is the biggest and best thing I can tell you. Is having those gadgets is one thing, but knowing how to use them is a whole nother story.
I think when you look at this plane crash, we were all very fortunate that the pilot of the plane also happened to be a career firefighter, because he did what is probably the most important thing you can do for somebody in that situation, and he stayed calm. And it's a very difficult thing to keep your wits about you when you have these circumstances that you're just not used to dealing with right in front of you and you don't see a way out of it. But if you can stay calm, then you'll be able to start to make a plan, or at least keep hope that somebody's coming to help you. There were a lot of people involved in this rescue. At one point I looked around and we probably had 50 people on scene. So once we know that you're in a bad spot, there are people coming. But in the meantime, you're going to be responsible for setting up some things to make that situation survivable for you, whether it be starting a fire or building a shelter. And all of those things that you wouldn't normally do in your day-to-day life, if you can't stay calm and stay focused on what your problem is, you're not going to be able to do that. So I think the biggest thing that I would tell people is take a couple of deep breaths, evaluate what options you've got, and start to make some decisions that are going to improve your situation, instead of just looking at the downside and starting to lose hope.